2019, there were about 16,000 murders in America. In 2020, there were more than 20,000. It's a 25% increase in 1 year. 2021 data isn't complete, but we know many cities have reached record levels of murder, including Philadelphia, Atlanta, and Milwaukee. At the same time, the prison population has decreased by about 14%, in part from pandemic policies, but also from fewer prosecutions and weaker sentencings. I think it's safe to say that there's a surge in crime, especially violent crime and murder across America. You have noted that some members of your family have law enforcement backgrounds, and I honor them and thank them for their service. Does the United States need more police or fewer police?
Thank you, Senator. As you just noted, I have law enforcement in my background, and I am very familiar with the problems that crime cause in the communities where we live.
Okay, Judge, I'm sorry. We have a few minutes here. You have a lifetime appointment if you're confirmed. I asked a simple either or question. Does the United States need more or fewer police?
Senator, the determination about whether there should be more or fewer police is a policy decision by another branch of government. It is not something that judges have control over, and I will stay in my lane in terms of the kinds of things that are properly in the judicial branch.
Okay, if you don't want to address whether the United States needs more or fewer police, we'll move on to sentencing, which is certainly in your lane. There's been a lot of talk about criminal justice and sentencing approaches and theories today. In general, is someone more likely or less likely to commit a crime if they know that they will be caught, convicted, and sentenced?
Senator, what is in my lane is the consideration of particular cases of
Judge,
prosecutions.
You've spoken a lot today about criminal sentencing, about the theory of sentencing. You've written a lot about it in your record. It is a very simple question. Is someone more likely or less likely to commit crime if they're more certain that they're going to be caught, convicted, and sentenced?
Senator, I am aware from my work on the Sentencing Commission and not as a judge that there is research into recidivism rates, into rehabilitation, into the factors that go into a determination about whether someone is more or less likely to commit crime. Part of what Congress has taken into account when it determined that one of the purposes of punishment is deterrence is the idea that if someone is convicted and punished, they will be deterred from committing other crimes.
And you've mentioned that, and you've written about that in your writings. There's 4 purposes of punishment. One of those is deterrence. Isn't it inherent in the concept of deterrence that people are less likely to commit crime if they're more likely to get caught, convicted, and sentenced? Why can't you just say that's the case?
Senator, it's not that I'm avoiding saying that's the case.
No, Judge, that's exactly what you're doing. I'm asking a very simple question. In general, is someone more likely or less likely to commit a crime if they know they're going to be caught, convicted, and sentenced?
It's very
part of deterrence theory.
It's very difficult to answer questions in general when you're asking about things that by punishing someone, they will be less likely to commit the crime in the future. That is a theory that
Do you think that theory is correct?
Senator, there is research that supports that deterrence is something that can occur. Does it occur in every case? I can't say that.
Okay, let's turn to something more concrete then. Do you know how long the average inmate convicted for a murder serves in prison in America?
No, I don't.
The answer is 17 years on average. Is 17 years too long or not long enough for a criminal to spend in prison for murder?
Senator, these are policy questions, whether they're in the province of the Sentencing Commission in terms of recommendations, whether they are in Congress. They're not the kinds of things that I can opine about.
So you don't want to opine on whether 17 years is too long or too short a sentence for murder?
Senator Cotton, the Congress has prescribed a number of factors that judges look at when they sentence. It may in many cases not be. I can't answer in the abstract in the way that you.
These are very concrete. Let's turn to rape. Do you know how long the average inmate convicted of rape serves in prison in America?
Well, Senator, rape is not a crime in the federal system that I'm familiar with working with, so I don't know.
It's 7.2 months. You think 7.2 months is too long or too short for someone convicted of rape to be sentenced to prison?
Senator, that's a policy question about the egregious crime of rape, and Congress has said that the court is supposed to take into account a number of factors when it sentences.
Okay.
I can't answer in the abstract.
Well, Judge, these are not abstract. These are very concrete. And remember, these are just the length of sentence if you're caught, convicted, and sentenced. Let's look at cases in which people are never caught. As I said, in 2020, murders increased by the fastest rate ever in the United States. Do you know what percentage of murders are solved in America?
Majority of cases.
I do not, Senator.
The answer is about half, 54% in 2020. Do you think we should catch and imprison more murderers or fewer murderers?
Well, Senator, it's very important that people be held accountable for their crimes. So that is a fundamental tenet of the rule of law.
So is that a yes, we should catch more murderers, specifically the 46% of murderers who get away with it?
Senator, I'm not, to the extent you're asking about enforcement or law enforcement, those.
Judge, it's a very simple and common sense question. 46% of all murders go unsolved. Should we catch more of those murderers or should we catch fewer of them?
Senator, we should hold people accountable for their crimes. And so if people are not being held accountable, then that is a problem.
Let's turn to assaults. Do you know how many assaults were solved in this country in 2020?
No, Senator.
44%. So 56% of all assault victims did not receive justice. Do you think we should catch and imprison more criminals who commit assault against innocent people or fewer?
Senator, it's very important that people be held accountable for their crimes. So if they're not, then it would be a problem for the rule of law.
Let's look at sexual assault and rape. Do you know what percentage of sexual assaults and rapes go unsolved in this country?
I do not, Senator.
77%, more than 3/4 of all sexual assaults and rapes go unsolved. Do you think we should catch and imprison more rapists and sex criminals or fewer?
Senator, one of my two uncles was a detective in a sexual crimes and battery unit. So I'm very familiar with that type of crime. It's a horrible type of crime, as are all of these that you are articulating. And it is important for people to be held accountable for criminal behavior. It's fundamental to the rule of law.
Okay. So in 2020 alone, well over 1 million violent crimes went unsolved in America. Do you think we imprison too many violent criminals or not enough?
Senator, it's important for our rule of law to ensure that people are held accountable who are breaking the law in the ways that you mentioned and otherwise.
What do you think the families of all those victims think? Do you think they think that we should arrest and convict and sentence all these criminals who get away with it?
Senator, I know what the families of law enforcement officers think because I'm one of them. I know what crime does to our society. I care deeply about public safety. And as a judge, it's been my duty when I was at the trial level, I'm no longer there, but when I was at the trial level, to ensure that people are held accountable for their crimes.
Okay. Let's turn to the crime of child pornography. I know there's been a lot of talk about it today. I don't want to spend much time on it. A lot of people have tried to explain the various differences in these cases and the pre-sentencing reports and the sentences that they got. So let me just ask you a simple question about it. Should the United States strengthen or weaken sentences for child pornographers?
Senator, that's not a simple question. And the reason is because what this country does in terms of penalties is in Congress's province. You all decide. You all decide what the penalties are. You decide what the factors are that judges use to sentence. If you determine that any set of penalties is insufficient, then it is in your purview to make that determination. There are many crimes that Congress has determined warrant mandatory minimum penalties, warrant other kinds of penalties, and that is in your purview to determine.
I say, Judge, I think whether or not we should strengthen or weaken sentences for child pornographers is a pretty simple question, but I'll move on. I think the difference we've heard today gets to this simple fact that a bunch of elite lawyers, whether they're judges or federal prosecutors or public defenders or law professors, think that sentences for child pornography are too harsh. I don't, and I bet a lot of normal Americans don't either. You've said repeatedly that sentencing is a discretionary act, and I understand that and I agree with it. But you always seem to use your discretion in these child pornography cases to reduce the sentences. I have to say, if I had that discretion, I'd probably throw the book at child pornographers. Maybe that's just me. But let's turn to drug crime. Last year, more than 100,000 Americans died from drug overdose. Drug overdose deaths and gang crime have both skyrocketed in recent years. At the same time, that a lot of soft on crime laws and lower sentences have been advocated, including on occasions, Judge, by yourself. In general, do you think the United States should weaken or strengthen sentences for fentanyl traffickers? Traffickers, not users.
Senator, whether or not Congress chooses to strengthen or weaken penalties for any crime is a determination of this body, which is ordinarily made after study and review, determination. That is in the province of Congress.
Well, Judge, you've said before that sentencing is a discretionary act, so that is literally the job of the judge in many of these cases to determine whether to have a shorter or a longer sentence.
Respectfully, Senator, the judge makes that determination not based on one data point in general, which is what you asked me. In general, should we lower or heighten sentences? A judge is making a determination in a particular case, looking at all of the factors. It's discretionary for sure, but we do so within the bounds of a sentencing range that Congress prescribes. And at times in which Congress decides that a penalty needs to be heightened, they impose a mandatory minimum. Then our range is shorter. And when we're looking at the crime, we're not looking as a policy matter across all fentanyl crimes and determining whether the penalty should be increased. As a judge, we are asked in the context of a single prosecution regarding a particular person who has committed a horrible crime, but also, says Congress, is a person who has a life, who has a job, who has all of the other factors that Congress has told judges they have to look at when they decide what penalty to impose in that particular case between the range that Congress sets. So it's not a situation in which I can, in my role as a judge, tell you as a general matter whether penalties should be increased or decreased.
I have to say, I think that not many Americans, especially not the 100,000 Americans who's lost someone to drug overdose, think these are tough questions. But let's move on. Let's talk about retroactivity. When you were on the Sentencing Commission, you repeatedly advocated for retroactively reducing drug trafficking sentences. So this is a case where a drug kingpin who's dealing fentanyl gets sentenced, and then a few years later, he gets lucky. He gets in front of some new judge who's maybe more sympathetic and thinks he got a raw deal, or maybe he just gets in front of the same judge a few years removed from seeing the faces of the victims of his crime. Do you believe that resentencing years after a conviction tends to reduce sentence lengths?
Senator, respectfully, I just wanted to remark on your previous question and your statement that these are not difficult questions. It's not that they're difficult questions, it's that they're not questions for me. I am not the Congress. I am not making policy around sentencing. My job is to look in a particular case and decide what the penalty should be within the range that Congress prescribes.
I understand. You were making policy, though, at the Sentencing Commission, and you're implementing changes to sentencing guidelines. So my question again is, do you believe that resentencing years after a conviction tends to reduce sentence lengths?
I'm not sure I understand your question. Obviously, if you resentence, you're giving the judge another opportunity to look at the circumstances in light of the changed penalties. Sometimes the judge in that new situation will keep the same penalty. A resentencing is just an opportunity for the judge to reevaluate in light of the changed circumstances.
Okay. Almost without exception, retroactively weakening sentencing laws and guidelines lets harden criminals out early. I always hear the argument. I hear it from some of the senators on this panel. I heard a version of it from you earlier, that each case is going to go before a judge and it won't be an automatic release because each judge is going to assess the facts and hear their arguments. In 2014, you said that judges would not likely reduce the sentences in the vast majority of cases if sentencing guidelines for drug trafficking were reduced. I think you missed that one, Judge. Since 2014, when retroactive reduction took effect, approximately 2/3 of all convicted drug traffickers who asked for early release got it. That's 31,614 hardened drug traffickers back on the streets. More than 7,500 of those hardened drug traffickers use weapons in their crimes. So that means that only 1/3 of these drug traffickers who sought to have retroactive reduction of their sentence were denied. Judges, 1/3, a vast majority.
Senator, it's hard for me to answer questions about these numbers because I'm trying to understand whether this is a retroactive release that was a result of the Sentencing Commission's actions or Congress's. Congress made a decision about retroactive reductions in drug penalties. So I'm just not sure what.
But Judge, in both cases, we always hear the argument, whether it's from members of Congress to include senators on this committee or the Sentencing Commission, that we shouldn't worry, there's going to be individualized case-by-case determination.
And that is my experience. That's when there is a retroactive change. So what happens is that whether it's the guidelines that are changed or the laws that are changed, which happens in Congress, there is a subsequent determination as to whether or not to apply that retroactively, apply that change, so that both the people who get convicted of that penalty moving forward and the people who have already been convicted, both of them get the benefit of the change if the determination is made to make it retroactive. Under that circumstance where you're talking about a penalty change applied to prior people, each one of those prior people goes back before a judge. And a judge, usually the sentencing judge in the first instance, will reevaluate whether or not to, this is generally, there's some exceptions, but generally speaking, the judge will reevaluate whether or not to give that person the benefit of the change. This is an individual assessment. That's what Congress requires in every sentence, and ultimately one that benefits all of us under the law, because judges are being asked to look at these cases and not make just generalized determinations.
So the 2014 comment was specifically about the Sentencing Commission, but generally, whether it's in front of the Commission or the Congress, we always hear this argument that judges are going to make these individualized cases and not that many people will be released. I'll point out that of the 1/3 that were not reduced, the vast majority of those were not eligible. The percentage of cases in which a sentence is not reduced for public safety reasons because someone is viewed as too dangerous to release early is 1%. It's 1%. Judge, do you remember a man named Keith Young?
Yes.
Good. For the benefit of my colleagues, let me quickly cover the basics of his case. You sentenced him in 2018. Keith Young was a career criminal who had previously been convicted of trafficking cocaine. In 2017, he was running a drug business in his house where his children lived and was found with 2 1-kilogram bricks of heroin worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, along with a gun, ammunition, thousands of dollars in cash, and equipment to cut and package heroin for retail sale. The drug lab also confirmed that there was fentanyl in both bricks of heroin. And in one of the 2 bricks, there was actually more fentanyl than there was heroin. While at the DC jail awaiting trial, Young bragged about his arrest and about how he was a kingpin. Those are his words, not mine. Kingpin. He was even recorded calling his wife and brother to give them instructions on collecting drug money from people for him. The prosecutors filed a notice of Young's criminal history, which meant he faced a mandatory minimum of 20 years. You did not seem to like that, Judge. In fact, at his sentencing, you said, this is a quote, that you shared his frustration, that you couldn't give him a lighter sentence. I was shocked to see this in the transcript. I was also shocked that you apologized to this drug kingpin for having to follow the law. You literally said that you didn't think 20 years was fair. This is the quote. And for this, I am sorry. Mostly because I believe in second chances. You apologized to this career criminal, a drug kingpin, in his own words. He was not some low-level first-time drug offender who made a bad choice. That was in 2018. But in 2020, you got a second chance. After Young's sentence, Congress passed something called the First Step Act, which reduced sentences for serious drug traffickers with lengthy criminal records. During the pandemic, lots of criminals like Keith Young tried to twist the First Step Act's compassionate release provision, which was intended for terminally ill elderly inmates to get early release and blame it on COVID. You had none of that, and that's good. You rightly said at his resentencing hearing, quote, COVID-19 is not only present in prisons, and you said that Young's past as a smoker and his claim of various other health issues did not entitle him to early release. If you had stopped there, I would have cited that as a great example of how you follow the law and made a well-reasoned decision. Unfortunately, you didn't stop there. You said in the resentencing that, quote, Congress did not make their changes under the First Step Act retroactive, but that if they had, then you could have given him a reduced sentence. But then you said, no matter what the law says, and this is a quote, Judge, the court feels as though in this moment, per Mr. Young's compassionate release motion, the court is being called upon to evaluate the length of his sentence under the revised section of the law in the First Step Act. And so it is almost as if I am sentencing him today. And if I were to do so, he would face a sentence that would be well below the 240 months that Mr. Young received. And so for that reason, I will grant Mr. Young's motion. Judge Jackson, before you granted this fentanyl kingpin's motion to reduce his sentence, did you contact any of the victims from his case?
Senator, thank you for allowing me to address Mr. Young's situation.
I asked a simple question. Did you contact the victims in his case or not?
Senator, Mr. Young was not released. His sentence was reduced, and I did not contact the victims in his case because there were no victims. He committed a crime, a drug crime. There were no identifiable victims in his case.
Drug crime is not a victimless crime. 100,000 Americans were killed by overdoses.
Understood, Senator, but there was no one to contact because there were no identifiable.
Judge, you just acknowledged that you did not release him. You're right, you didn't release him. He filed a motion for compassionate release. You denied that rightly, but you reduced his sentence. He didn't file a motion to reduce his sentence. He wasn't eligible for a reduced sentence under the First Step Act because it wasn't retroactive towards him. You took a motion for compassionate release to get out of prison and turned it into a motion to reduce a sentence. So he's going to be released 7.5 years earlier, years from now. Last week, Judge, when we talked in our office, you talked about a lot about judicial restraint. Is transforming his motion for compassionate release into a motion to reduce a sentence for this drug trafficking kingpin an example of judicial restraint, Judge?
Yes, Senator, it is, and I will explain how. Mr. Young, as you say, was facing originally a sentence of 20 years in prison, which I imposed. I tried Mr. Young, who went to trial primarily because he was facing such a long penalty. I looked at the evidence in his case. He was absolutely the kingpin that you're talking about. But the way that our laws work, the 20-year sentence that he received for the amount of heroin that he had was increased based on a sentence that he received, I think it was 10 or 15 years before. He had no criminal history between the old sentence. Forgive me, I can't remember exactly what it is, and I'm sure people will look it up. But 10, 15 years before, he had some minor sentence. Then he had this really obviously serious, terrible sentence. And the government filed what is called an 851, which is an enhancement based on his really, really old prior criminal history. I followed the law, which said that he had to go to jail for 20 years. It would have been more like 10 years if the government hadn't taken into account his very old criminal history. But I said, fine, this is the law. I'm following it. You're going to jail for 20 years. In the interim, COVID happens. We get lots of compassionate release motions, and there's a statute that Congress has enacted which allows defendants to seek compassionate release, to seek reduction of their sentence, not just release, reduction, release, some adjustment to their penalty under the law if there are extraordinary and compelling reasons to do so. That's the quote from the statute, extraordinary and compelling reasons. Doesn't say anything more narrow than that, although you do have to look at the guidelines related to compassionate release, all of which I did related to his motion. And he argued several things. He argued his smoking, his asthma. These were reasons, he said, for compassionate release, and I disagreed. What I did find extraordinary and compelling is the fact that between the 20-year sentence that I gave him originally and the compassionate release motion that he filed, Congress changed the law. Congress decided that the old penalty, the old crime, was no longer eligible for the increased, so that a person who was convicted at the time of his compassionate release motion for doing exactly what Mr. Young had done would not get a 20-year sentence. That would not be lawful for a person at that moment. And one of the things that Congress says to the judges is care about unwarranted sentencing disparity. Care about the fact that the person you're sentencing is being treated differently than someone else who committed exactly the same crime. And I understand it wasn't retroactive in the sense that everybody, absent a compassionate release motion, wouldn't have been eligible for resentencing. But here I have a defendant before me and all of the factors that Congress has asked me to take into account, and a compelling argument that there were extraordinary and compelling circumstances, that is a change in the law, that would create unwarranted sentencing disparity if I didn't take account of it. And so what I determined under those circumstances is that I would resentence Mr. Young to the penalty that Congress had decided was the appropriate penalty for the conduct that he committed as of the time of his motion.
Judge, Congress did change the law after sentencing in the First Step Act. That was a terrible mistake. Congress specifically did not make that change retroactively. And you saw that and you thought it was extraordinary and compelling. even though Congress specifically did not make it retroactive. You chose to rewrite the law because you were sympathetic to a fentanyl drug kingpin whom you had expressed frustration at having sentenced him to his 20-year sentence in the first place. You twisted the law and you rewrote it so you could cut the sentence of a drug kingpin. That's what you did, Judge.
Respectfully, Senator, I disagree. Congress provided judges through the compassionate release motion mechanism with the opportunity to review sentences. Congress, prior to the compassionate release mechanism being enacted, a judge who imposed a sentence would have no opportunity to revisit. In Mr. Young's case, the question was, with this compassionate release motion, under a circumstance in which Congress had changed the law, was that an extraordinary and compelling circumstance to revisit his sentence? And I made a determination that it was.
So I suppose then, if you're confirmed, we can just count on you to always rule in favor of retroactivity, no matter what the facts of the case are, because it was a blatant rewrite of the law here. So you could reduce the sentence of a drug kingpin if you didn't like sentencing to 20 years in the first place.
No, Senator, it was not.
Senator Booker.
Approaching 11 hours now of a long day. And forgive me, I want to go back to one of my early senators, Lindsey Graham. I think he asked you something, and I'd like to just put it this way. On a scale from 1 to 10, how deep is your faith? That I want to ask that question.
You're asking me, or
No,
you won't ask me?
I'm just joking.
Okay.
I won't ask you that, but I do want to go through some of the things that some of my colleagues did on top line. And forgive me, I don't want to dwell too much, but some of it I found today just to me really didn't hold water. And I want to start with my friend and colleague, Ted Cruz, who is my friend. He's a Texan. One of my favorite Texans is Brene Brown's, who says it's hard to hate up close, so pull people in. And a lot of times in this culture of tribal politics, the reality is we know each other, we get to know each other over years, and I've had the privilege of working with Ted on a lot of really good policy. So I went back to my office and re-listened to his questioning of you about critical race theory, and he referenced your speech, which I hadn't read. You Harvard folks are so well focused on these things, but I read your speech, and I was very surprised. Ted had a very big chart. I think he needs to give Senator Whitehouse some advice on charts. Senator Whitehouse, this was very small. It was almost as they were proportionate to their state sizes. But
easy there in New Jersey.
Mr. Chairman, I would request that my colleagues in the Democratic Party would stop interrupting me. But he talked about your speech, and when I read your speech, there's a couple things that jumped out. First of all, he acknowledged it was a very powerful speech, very moving speech about extraordinary Black women. I have a criticism. Your mother was not in it, but I will leave that alone. But there's some things he honed in on, almost as if they seemed to be accusations, which don't hold merit to me. We have a saying in New Jersey, I felt it was all hat and no cattle. And so he said that you called the woman who wrote the 1619 Project, that you called her provocative. That's not a compliment necessarily if you call someone provocative, is it?
No.
No, I mean, I think Ted Cruz is very provocative, and that doesn't mean I agree with what he's saying, his philosophy. Doesn't mean I agree with his statements. But he pointed out you also called the author acclaimed. She won a Pulitzer Prize, correct?
She did.
In journalism, so she is acclaimed.
She is.
But in nowhere are you heralding her as this is reflective of your philosophy. That's true, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So I don't understand that at all. Part of his chart also was a lot of ellipses, skipping out things, but you mentioned critical race theory when you're talking about policies in general. I actually went back to that talk too, and I saw you threw everything in there. You were talking about psychology, economics, all different types of disciplines as touching upon the law. I think there was everything in there I seemed to be, except for astrology. But you you understand that you were just listing a list of things that people could say touch the law. They weren't your philosophies at all.
Correct, Senator. And that speech was not related to what I do as a judge. That was talking about sentencing policy and all of the different academic disciplines that might relate to it.
Yeah, and then finally, we're entering an age that is surprising to me in American society, where lots of books are being banned and lots of talks about books being read. You're on the board of a private school, and you have no supervision or authority over what books the children read in a private school, correct?
Correct.
I really do appreciate that. Jumping really quickly to a lot of talk today about these child exploitation cases. And Senator Durbin, I think that actually Josh Hawley used the word attack when describing his own. So I don't understand what that point of sensitivity was. But I individual cases, and we've now heard about two. You've presided over as a judge more than 10, 15 cases.
I've presided over 14 cases that involve child sex crimes, but over my career as a trial judge, I've presided over more than 100.
Right. And cases are heavily fact specific, right?
That is true.
Did you remember all the facts of the case that Senator Hawley was?
I did not.
You did not, right. And the facts matter, right?
They do.
And as a judge, you're looking at all of the facts of the case, not just what might be talked about later or what people are honing in. You have to take everything into account and make a decision, correct?
Yes, that's what Congress has required judges to do.
Right. And just to clarify that Congress thing, because again, you went to this elite law school. I went to a gritty inner city law school, Yale. So you know this better than me, but it was actually 1984 that the sentencing laws, the sentencing standards were passed down, correct?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, it was 1984. And then later in 2002 or 3, things were updated. But that 1984 was before the internet completely. And I just want to clarify also the Booker decision.
Yes.
Could you just clarify for the record, because my mom might be watching, no relation to me whatsoever, correct?
So the Booker decision, which earlier I mentioned that I thought Justice Scalia wrote it. In fact, it was Justice Stevens.
Yes.
But Justice Scalia concurred. So he had a separate opinion, and he had written a previous decision that was very similar.
Yes.
The Booker decision made the guidelines, the sentencing guidelines, advisory.
Why? Why would the Supreme Court, joined by some of the most conservative members, why would they do that?
Well, they determined that, in essence, the Booker, that if the guidelines were mandatory, that it would violate the right to a jury trial to have jurors decide every aspect of your sentencing.
Yeah,
So,
it's sort of the separation of powers, Sixth Amendment.
yes,
This is really important.
yes,
And so that gave judges latitude.
yes.
Now, if you were falling out of the norm, and this is where, I've now read conservative periodicals looking at this line of attack. That's not a negative pejorative. Again, my colleague himself used it, but this line of attack on you, I've seen conservative papers, liberal papers, mainstream papers, all say this doesn't hold water. And the reason is, and again, unlike White House and Cruz, I don't have a chart. I'm uncharted. But I would like to hold this up for you. You are well within the norm nationally for going below the sentencing guidelines because of this problem where you have this incongruency that judges on both sides of that have been pointed by people of both sides of the aisle have seen. I just want to make that very clear. You are well within the norm in the United States of America. I'm a former mayor, and one of my favorite mayor friends used to always say, "In God we trust, but everybody else bring me data." and so the data kind of shows that you're not some outlier. And forgive me, because you're not allowed to do this, but I kind of sat here and was a little insulted about the accusation that somehow this mother of two, confirmed 3 times by the United States Senate, who has victim advocacy groups writing letters for you, who has child victims advocacy groups supporting you, who has presided over fact-specific cases of the most heinous crimes, that somehow the implication that you are somehow out of the norm of other federal judges that we have confirmed where these issues have never come up, who, again, I held up this chart, but the majority of the decisions, a percentage of sentences below guideline range in non-production child pornography cases, in DC, 80% of them are under the guidelines. In Missouri, 77%, in Iowa, 62%, in North Carolina, 77%, in Nebraska, 81%, and so on and so on and so forth, down to Utah, alphabetical order, 71%. And so this implication that somehow your thoughtfulness on these very dense, fact-specific cases is somehow out of the norm, to me, does not hold up, doesn't head water. And then you add that to the endorsements that you have gotten from folks that deal with victim advocacy groups. It is, to me, just a line of attack that it does not hold and in no way for me. I'm sorry. And the totality of your career, what you've accomplished and what you've done. I just think it's unfortunate that, unlike the sort of fair arbiters of this on both sides of the aisle who've dismissed it, I appreciate the way you've sat there and addressed all of that stuff. And that really brings me to the larger implication. You talked a lot about your uncles. One of them served in Baltimore, is that right? As a police officer?
My brother was a police officer in Baltimore.
The gentleman over there?
Yes.
Who volunteered to serve in the United States military?
Yes.
And you have talked about that police work, right?
Yes.
I live in Newark. I love my city. If you cut me, I bleed bricks. And I was going with the nickname of our city is Brick City. Your brother and I probably understand something. The majority of murder victims in the United States of America, do you know who the majority of murder victims are?
I don't.
They're Black men. I imagine in your conversations with your brother and your two uncles, you who patrolled some of these streets, I imagine you feel in a different way about the anguish of what many communities of color struggle with when it comes to crime. Am I right there?
You are right, Senator. It is very anguishing, and it is something that I know all too well.
And you are a person that has that same fear that many mothers have for their daughters who do go out in this world. My mom used to say, when you have a child, it's like your heart going around outside of your body all of a sudden. And I just find it hard to believe, given your law enforcement background, you're a mom, that you take any of this urgency to keep America safe. And then I see that, like, folks I know well. I've worked with the FOP. I began negotiating with them. I have to say, I thought Jim Pascoe, before I knew him, it's a whole thing, Brene Brown, bring people close. At first, I thought he was an ogre, biggest police union in the, I had some tough negotiations with my police union. He and I sat down and we shared our stories. And I think we realized we were coming from the same place when we were working on police reform. FOP endorsed you, and they wrote a powerful letter. I won't read it again. The IACP, they represent the largest, that's the rank and file, the FOP. The IACP represents the bosses, the managers. They endorse you. There's another group that maybe my colleagues don't know as well as I do. It's called Noble. Do you know them?
I do.
They're the Black law enforcement organization nationally. People like your brother
Yes.
who love their communities,
Yes.
who have seen, like I have, too many young men lying with bullet holes, bleeding into our pavements. These are folks who come from communities like your brother knows, where you too often see sidewalk shrines to murdered youth. I've talked to the women and men of Noble so many times. Anybody ever accuse them of being soft on crime? But they understand the complicated factors of crime in our country. And what they have to say to you about you, I won't read it, is just beautiful. Law enforcement family, mother of two, law enforcement organization after law enforcement organization, victims advocacy organizations after victims advocacy organizations, Republican appointed judges, Democratic appointed judges. That's who's in your corner. We're politicians. We have a sworn oath right now. I've just watched you with dignity and grace field what I can only imagine is behind those questions, is this doubt that is being sown. I just want America to know that when it comes to my family's safety, when it comes to Newark, New Jersey, or my state, God, I trust you. I trust you. Now, I brought in your mother, and I have to go back there. My mom has a saying that is awfully embarrassing when she talks about me. She says, she'll introduce me and she'll say, behind every successful child is an astonished parent. But there's something about your mother looking at her is that she doesn't seem all too astonished. She seems like almost just very slyly, she knew that a day like this might come. And so I just want to share with you that I have done a lot of hiring. Before I was in a legislative body, I ran New Jersey's largest city. And I could write a book about all the management mistakes I made in my first year and how it made me a really good manager. And the first mistake I made was I was just looking for the most talented, credentialed, skillful, smart people to help me run things. And I soon learned it wasn't enough. I made some mistakes in hiring. And I began to see that those skills, which you have a tremendous amount of, it's been said so many times, if stacking you up against other Supreme Court justices, you have more qualifications, more credentials than many of them. But I learned that you should hire first, that's necessary credentials, but not sufficient, that you should hire for character. That's what made me hire a great team in Newark eventually. And we operated so well. And so I believe I've gotten to know your character over these weeks, but I want America to know a little bit more about your character right now. And so I know my values. Booker T. Washington said it. James Baldwin said it. Children are never good at listening to their elders, but they never fail to imitate them. If I want to know your character, you haven't let me do this yet, but I want to hang out with your parents a little bit. And so let's draw them into this conversation. We won't swear them under oath, but just could you share with me what are their bedrock values that are most a part of your values now that you hope and pray are your grandchildren's, unborn grandchildren's values? What are those most important values you inherited from those two folk over there?
Thank you, Senator. I inherited a number of bedrock values, as you say, from my extraordinary parents. As I mentioned, my parents grew up in a time in this country in which Black children and white children were not allowed to go to school together. They persevered. They were the first in their families to go to college, to have that chance. They each went to historically Black universities, and they taught me hard work. They taught me perseverance. They taught me that anything is possible in this great country. And I think it came, as I said in my introduction, from the sea change that we had in this country from the 1960s when Congress passed 2 Civil Rights Acts and African Americans finally had the chance to become a part of the dream, become a part of the fabric of this wonderful nation. My parents moved to Washington, D.C. because this is where it all started for them in terms of having new freedoms. And I was born here on that hope and dream. I was born here with an African name, and my parents gave me to demonstrate their pride in who they were and their pride and hope in what I could be.
And it seems to me, as a guy whose parents came here, and you and I both were born here months apart, I would hear my parents' tough stories at the dinner table about facing bigotry. Here in the city, my father told me stories about his early jobs, but I never noticed a hint of bitterness or that hate he saw. Never generated hate with him. In fact, he just loved people, all people.
That is correct, Senator. And I would say that my wonderful parents went on to become extraordinary public servants. They had new opportunity. They could have done, other things, but each of them decided to give back to the community. My mother was in the public school system. She was a teacher and then became an administrator, became the principal of a magnet school for the arts in Miami, a new school that had started up, and became the sort of beloved principal of New World School of the Arts. And so many of her students continue to see me, meet me, and they know me from my mother, which is fantastic.
And she had diverse students.
She had extraordinarily
And she
diverse.
loved on all those children.
Everyone.
Black, white, Asian.
Everyone.
Well, let me ask you this, because I'm going to push you a little harder, because I have some people I really respect on the other side of the aisle, and they do. My friends and I talk about religion sometimes. Faith is important. I was teasing Senator Graham earlier, but I don't want to ask you anything specific about your faith except for this, because you brought it up in your opening statement. And I have to tell you, I don't think Black women have any providence over struggle. People from all backgrounds in America struggle. But I do know often, as trailblazing Black women, they have often faced many challenges being the first, or being a trailblazer, or breaking glass ceilings. But I know on your journey to this moment right now, you have faced very tough moments. Probably you've been knocked down by life. I always say, if America hasn't broken your heart, you don't love her enough. You've been heartbroken by circumstance. You've been like Zora Neale Hurston, who says, I've been through sorrow's kitchen and I licked out all the pots. You've been like Langston Hughes to that poem, Mother to Son, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. Could you talk to me maybe about one moment, or what you do when you get knocked down like that? Where do you get the grit and the guts to get back up and keep on going?
Well, Senator, I think that too is something that I learned from my grandparents, who, as I said, didn't have it easy. My grandparents, who didn't have a lot of formal education, but who were the hardest working people I've ever known, and who just got up every day and put one foot after the other and provided for their families and made sure that their children went to college, even though they never had those opportunities. I reflect on them in the context of this historic moment. I stand on the shoulders of people from that generation, and I focus at times on my faith when I'm going through hard times. Those are the kinds of things that I learned from my grandmother, who used to have those family dinners and bring us all together. And I think that's a common experience of Americans, that when you go through difficult times, you lean into family and you turn to faith. And that's part of my experience as well.
It's, I think, the experience of my colleagues and I on both sides of the aisle, leaning on that faith and that family. I want to give you, there's one thing about your opening statement, and I have to say, I haven't actually shaken your husband's hand yet, but yesterday I was mad at him because when he started tearing up at your remarks about him, it triggered, I don't really have it, but it triggered a sympathetic cry in me as well. So I'm a little upset at him, but I will deal with him individually. But you said something that I found provocative, to use that word one more time. And I felt afterwards, I reflected, I even talked to my staff about it because I thought that statement, it didn't seem congruent to me. And it was, I don't know if it was a profession of humility or overly critical of yourself. But I want to end in my last 5 minutes giving you space to explain yourself to me because much to my mom's chagrin, I am not a parent yet. And I'm looking at somebody that I admire, but you said something that struck me because look, my mom was a working mom. And God, it was tough. My colleagues will not believe this, but there was a time I was very melodramatic, and I was in a bathtub of oatmeal bathtub, and my mom was getting ready to go on a business trip, and I look at her with these sad eyes, and I say, "Mom, if you leave me, I'll die." And she looked at me, knowing that you don't die from the chicken pox, but I still remember her going to the phone, having a long conversation, taking off her business suit and changing into her sweatpants. She would tell me later that was not a sign of love. She loved me, but a lot of women who love their kids can't stay home because we don't have paid family leave in this country. So you said in your opening remarks that you haven't been as good of a parent, I think if I'm paraphrasing right, as good as a mom as you'd like to be. And I looked at your two girls, and I look at you, and I don't understand that statement. Could you maybe explain for me what you meant, and maybe take one more beat and explain to me what it means to you to be a mom of two young women growing up in America today?
Thank you, Senator. What I said in my statement was that that I had struggled, like so many working moms, to juggle motherhood and career. And it takes a lot of hard work to become a judge, to do the work of a judge, which I've done now for almost 10 years. You have a lot of cases. You don't have all that many resources, comparatively speaking, and it's a lot of early mornings and late nights. And what that means is there will be hearings during your daughter's recitals. There'll be emergencies on birthdays that you have to handle. And I know so many young women in this country, especially who have small kids, who have these momentous events and have to make a choice. You talked about your mom making the choice to make sure that she cared for you in that moment. And there are times when obviously you have to care for your family members. There are other times when there are events that you wish you could be a part of, but here's the emergency case that you have to deal with. And so I said in my opening that girls, you've had to deal with me juggling motherhood and job responsibilities, and I didn't always get the balance right. And so I would hope for them seeing me, hopefully you all will confirm me, seeing me moved to the Supreme Court, that they can know that you don't have to be perfect in your career trajectory and you can still end up doing what you want to do, that you just have to understand that there are lots of responsibilities in the world and that you don't have to be a perfect mom, but if you do your best and you love your children, that things will turn out okay.
Well, I'm sure your mom probably feels she wasn't perfect, but things have turned out okay. And I will tell you this. I'm sure they've said it, and if they haven't, I'm sure they will. The older I get, the more I appreciate my parents. I know they're proud of you, but as a guy who does have faith, And I sit at home in a room of my ancestors where I have generations of my ancestors' pictures up, and they're black folk and white folk. I have a very interesting family tree. I sit there to feel my ancestors sometimes and think about them. I hope right now, in this questions and blistering, that you know that at that desk there are a whole lot of spirits around you with their hands on you. Not only your children and your parents proud, but so are your ancestors. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Booker. And Judge Jackson, a lot of politicians on this committee, 22 of them. There's only one Cory Booker. And when he does his cross-examination on the human side, I always wait to see, can the witness get through this without a little emotion? There was a little there, as there should have been, as he talked about your family and your parents and your children. Cory, you're one of a kind. We love you. We have 3 more to ask questions tonight. Senator Kennedy, Senator Padilla, Senator Blackburn. We're going to break for 20 minutes, grab a bite to eat, freshen up, come back for the last round.
Thank you.
Senate stands in recess.
The 8th California Reparations Task Force meeting is scheduled for March 29th and March 30th.
All California Reparations Task Force meetings are open to the public and welcome public comment. Amend the Mass Media Group provides coverage of all California Reparations Task Force meetings. Tune in, tap in, and testify. Reparations Now fam,